let me turn to Ambassador Joseph. Ambassador, you were in charge of arms control, nonproliferation, all matters nuclear. So clearly you have a perspective on what we've seen going back to the first conversations in 2011, or actually before then, during the aughts, when Rouhani and his friends later bragged about lying to European and American and nuclear negotiators. But I want to invite you to go beyond the nuclear file, because you really have studied the entirety of the policy. Give us your thoughts on where we've gone, where we've come from, and where the U.S. should be thinking about going. In a way, I will say, that would be sensible to people regardless of what political party they are in.
Link, thank you very much. Let me also thank the organizers, the NCRI, of course, and the MEK. As Link says, my background is in the nuclear field, nuclear deterrence, nuclear arms control, nuclear nonproliferation. My first occasion to learn of the NCRI and MEK was in August of 2002. When I was working at the White House, I was an assistant to the president. I was in charge of weapons of mass destruction, nuclear nonproliferation, working very hard on Iran, North Korea, and some of the other challenges that we had. And I'm informed by my staff that there's someone giving a briefing on the Iranian nuclear program. And I get a feedback on what that briefing is all about. And I asked my staff 3 questions. I said, first of all, how does this fellow know more about the Iranian nuclear weapons program than I do? Second, what is a terrorist group doing giving a briefing a block away from the White House? And third, how do I pronounce this guy's last name? Well, since then, I've learned a great deal about the MEK and the NCRI. I've learned of the personal sacrifices of every single member that I've met and talked with. Members who have lost brothers and sisters and mothers and fathers, but in a way that has not at all lessened their dedication, lessened their intention to work toward a free and democratic Iran. It truly is inspiring when you talk to the residents at Ashraf and you talk to the leadership, particularly Mrs. Rajavi, who has provided us with a 10-point plan that provides the vision for the future. And with the MEK and NCRI, we have the alternative to the current regime. So let me just start there in terms of my perspective on U.S. policy. But let me first say that I am of the old school. What I say is not to blame the United States for the many offenses of the Iranian regime, whether it's sponsorship of terrorism, aggression in the region, the pursuit of nuclear weapons, and the brutalization of their own people, the crimes against humanity that they have committed. The fault, the blame lies solely with a regime, with the mullahs who have hijacked the great nation of Iran and Islam itself. With that, let me say that I have been a long-term critic, constructive critic of U.S. policy. I even played that role when I was a career civil servant, which resulted in my exile on a number of occasions. Civil servants don't get fired, they just get exiled. But that was okay because I could speak my mind, and I did speak my mind. Sometimes it hurt, sometimes it was beneficial. But at all times, I felt that we needed to emphasize the relationship between nonproliferation, nuclear nonproliferation, and human rights. And perhaps I learned that lesson in my first job when I served in the Reagan administration, again as a civil servant. But I was working as the Defense Department representative to the arms control negotiations, both at the ministerial and then at the at the summit level. And I learned about the biases and the bad instincts of the institutions that were involved. All of them trying to push human rights out of the room so that we could get down to the real business of national security and negotiate arms control treaties. They had one principal obstacle to that, and that was President Reagan. And President Reagan insisted that we continue to have a four-part agenda with the Soviet Union, which included human rights, as much as that was resisted by the bureaucracies, by the institutions of the national security complex, which always treated human rights in a separate silo. We always said good things about human rights, but it was in a separate silo from national security issues. But Reagan insisted that we break that silo and that we push human rights. And Reagan is often criticized for taking a very sort of simplistic, was the word that was often used, approach to national security issues. He was criticized when he was asked about his strategy for the Cold War, which was, he said, we win, they lose, which was the right answer. And it was his policies, including the promotion of human rights, that got us there. And human rights was far from an obstacle to achieving arms control. We achieved the best arms control agreements under the Reagan and then into the first Bush administration because of human rights, in large part, as well as other factors. So let me sketch out sort of what I see as an alternative to US policy. And I'll let you sort of make the comparison and the contrast with US policy today. I would say that an effective US national security policy toward Iran would be grounded in four propositions. This is my academic sort of side coming out here, so excuse me, but four propositions. The first proposition is that for 44 years, US policy has failed. It has failed to stop Iran's support of international terrorism. My boss, Condi Rice, referred to it as the international banker for international, the central banker for international terrorism. We have failed to stop Iranian support of aggression in the region. And in fact, Iran, the regime has achieved successes in the region through its aggression. Just think of the murderous Assad regime prevailing and reestablishing itself as the principal authority in Syria, Iraq, Yemen, the many instances of regional aggression. The nuclear program. Iraq today is a virtual nuclear weapon state. We're told that they have enough enriched uranium at 60% enrichment to have three weapons. They could have enriched uranium at weapons grade within days, at most within a couple of weeks. That is a failure. And I think most of all, at least in my view, we have failed in promoting and consistently applying the principle of human rights and democracy that every administration talks about. If you go back through all of the national security strategies, one foundational principle of American policy is the promotion of human rights and democracy. And in the case of Iran, we have sacrificed that principle in order to seek other benefits, other agreements, which have never really turned out well for us. Because as I said, we have failed. We have failed on regional aggression, we have failed on international terrorism, and we have failed on stopping Iran from moving forward on its nuclear program. The second principle that I would apply in any national strategy toward Iran is that as long as the mullahs rule, they will never abandon their nuclear weapons program. They simply will not abandon that, and they have proven that over and over. Yes, they will negotiate at times, but the agreements are not worth the paper that they're written on. Maybe that's why we're going to a paperless agreement in the future. Third, and we heard other speakers address this in the previous panels, this is a regime that can't reform. This is a regime that cannot be, as much as we want it to be, a moderate sort of, ruled by moderate leaders. And we have pursued policies that we believed would encourage moderation. I mean, one of the selling points of the JCPOA, despite the fact that it was a fatally flawed agreement, and I testified to that effect before the Senate, but one of the selling points was that the mullahs would take this money and put it into the economy. It would become a benefit to the Iranian people. It would lead to greater pluralism. Well, we know what happened to the billions and billions of dollars. It went into supporting terrorism. It went into regional aggression. It went into their nuclear program. It went into their missile program. And it went into the repression of the people of Iran. And that, I think, is not going to change. So the fourth proposition is that it is the people of Iran that are the greatest vulnerability, that represent the greatest vulnerability of the regime. The regime has alienated its people through brutality, through repression, over 4 decades, through mass murder, through the mass murder of tens of thousands of their own citizens. This is a regime that cannot, as I said, reform, that will continue the brutality until it is ended. And it is that sort of end that we need to think about. But it is the vulnerability from the people that lies at the heart of a different strategy. And that is a strategy that puts human rights up front, puts human rights and the promotion of democracy at the center of the policy. Of course, along with all of the tools of statecraft, with the military tools, with the economic tools, with the diplomatic tools, with the intelligence tools, bringing them all together in an integrated way to contain the regime, to deter and defend against the regime, and ultimately to bring down the regime through the support of the people of Iran. Let me just say what this alternative approach is not. It is not the advocacy of force by the US or the West to overthrow the government of Iran. It's not regime change like we saw in Iraq. I think we've learned our lesson from that. This is regime change, as I said, from within, led by the Iranian people, but supported from the outside, hopefully with the United States as the leader of that support. This is not a silver bullet. What we need is the application of a comprehensive strategy over time with patience, with strength, and of course with leadership. Leadership that understands the 4 propositions that I put forward. This is an approach that I think resembles that of Ronald Reagan dealing with the Soviet Union. Ronald Reagan thought the Soviet Union was evil. Would he talk to them? Would he negotiate with them? Yes. But he wouldn't make concessions. He wouldn't appease. When Gorbachev demanded that Ronald Reagan give up the Strategic Defense Initiative at Reykjavik, Ronald Reagan said no. No agreement was better than a bad agreement. But that principle of no agreement is better than a bad agreement is stated by every president of the United States, but I think it only applied in the context of Ronald Reagan, because we've had one bad agreement after another bad agreement. And I think that we need to recognize that it's important to understand, and this is the final thing that this strategy is not, it is not an end to diplomacy. We're often criticized, well, if you don't negotiate, it's an end to diplomacy. But diplomacy and negotiation, particularly negotiation and appeasement, which are closely tied together in US policy, they're not synonymous, they're different. And we need diplomacy as an important component, but it's not diplomacy through negotiations and concessions. And the discussion today about an unwritten, informal agreement, as one of our panelists said last night, a gentleman's agreement with Iran. Just think of that, a gentleman's agreement with Iran. But that raises the question, can you negotiate with evil? And this was touched upon earlier. And the answer is clearly yes. Of course you can negotiate with evil. Hitler and Chamberlain, proved that, you can negotiate with evil. Chamberlain came back to London waving a piece of paper saying, we've got peace in our time. And what happened? We all know it went to war, but there's a quote of Hitler's that's always stayed with me. The German generals after Munich are very concerned about going into Poland. Hitler assembles his generals. And he tells them, he says, look, I watched them at Munich. They were nothing but little worms. And Germany went into Poland. That's what appeasement gets you. And I think that's what we need to avoid. Because I think we're at that point where further appeasement will truly meet the definition, Einstein's definition of insanity. Okay, trying the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. It's clearly doomed to failure. The alternative that I'm talking about is to support the opposition, the democratic opposition, is to contain and deter the regime from further expansion, from further success along the four lines that I have mentioned. The regime needs to be pressured. I think we're at a critical point. I think we're near the breaking point. And the last thing we need to do is throw the regime a lifeline, as we have in the past. We need to push harder, and we need to remember that human rights is a foundational principle of our policy and the means that we achieve our national security objectives. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Bob. You have put forward quite a vision that incorporates human rights into policies that contain and address the threat from Iran. How do we get accountability, more accountability than we have seen with the United States, with our friends in France, the UK, elsewhere? What can governments do to turn up the throttle on accountability for crimes against humanity, for human rights abuses that exceed anything we've seen in the democratic West?
Well, that's a great question, Lincoln. I don't really have a great answer to that because we have failed, I think, to date to send a powerful signal from the international community to the leaders of the regime that they will be held accountable. We think that one would think that with the precedent of holding Nazi leadership accountable could be useful in signaling to the regime that we are in the process of taking names, associating those names with the atrocities, and truly the mass murder of tens of thousands of Iranians. And if the international community were to send that strong signal with American leadership, because I think it really will depend on American leadership, that would be a warning. But we have not appeared to be serious. So whether that warning would be received, I'm not sure. We have to demonstrate over time that we are serious about this. And I think you demonstrate that seriousness in other ways. You demonstrate it through your military posture. You demonstrate it through your diplomatic posture. The regime has got to know that we are pushing and pressuring for an end, for their end, and that end is coming. I do, as I said, think that they're at a breaking point. A regime that would poison hundreds of schoolgirls is a desperate regime. And that desperation is going to lead, I think, to their unfolding. My concern is that we'll throw them a lifeline. My concern is that we'll have an agreement in which Iran says, well, we won't go beyond 60% in terms of our enrichment. If you relieve the pressure, if we can have the resources, if you tell the IAEA that you're not going to push for investigations of their weaponization activities. And in exchange, we'll throw in some more hostages. We'll give them back to you. And in the next room, they're saying, okay, go arrest 4 more hostages so we have them for the next time. I mean, we need to be realistic about the threat and understand their motivations and understand their vulnerabilities. And I said the greatest vulnerability comes from the people of Iran and the inspirational leadership and the vision that I think is reflected in Mrs. Rajavi's 10-point plan.
Thank you.